Back in June, an email came across my inbox. It was an invitation to witness for justice and compassion in the desert by attending an action called Faith Floods the Desert. I looked at my calendar and saw that I was in charge of the Sunday services on that first weekend in August, the date the action was scheduled for. Oh well, I thought, and I dismissed it. Except that the idea wouldn't go away. So I met with Angela and told her that I was considering going, and we thought through some possibilities together, and we were ultimately able to come up with a plan that would free me from my responsibilities on that Sunday. So with that barrier removed, I went about rescheduling all of the other commitments that I had. It took a little shuffling, but I was able to make it happen. Now, I can't say exactly why this invitation, this calling, felt so important. I've been reflecting on it in the context of this month's theme, vocation, about which Parker Palmer writes, "Vocation at its deepest level is something that I can't not do, for reasons I'm unable to explain to anyone else and don't fully understand myself, but that are nonetheless compelling." It's this idea of vocation as something I can't not do that resonates with me. Last week, Angela explored how the paid work we do fits into our ideas of identity and vocation. But this particular vocation, this call to action in the desert, would be a call away from my paid work, not towards it. And yet it felt like something that I couldn't not do. And so I answered the call for Faith Floods the Desert. And now a word on how the Faith Floods the Desert action came to be. Up until earlier this year, No More Deaths, a humanitarian aid organization in Arizona, was generally allowed to go about their work unobstructed by law enforcement agencies with jurisdiction along the U.S.-Mexico border. But in February, a No More Deaths volunteer was charged with 3 felony counts for providing food, water, beds, and clean clothes to 2 individuals in need. Can you believe those are federal felonies? Who decided that we needed a law against providing food, water, beds, and clean clothes? And shortly after this, 8 more No More Deaths volunteers were charged with felony misdemeanors for littering. The litter they allegedly left in the desert was life-saving water and food, like this. In light of this increased hostility, the Faith Floods the Desert action was organized as a call to bear witness to these injustices. It was a call to denounce both the mistreatment of migrants and the criminalization of providing humanitarian aid. And it was a call to act, to deliver life-saving water to the deadly desert. And so approximately 60 clergy and faith leaders and lay leaders showed up to the little town of Ajo, Arizona, and we spent all day Saturday learning about the work of No More Deaths, the increasing hostility of law enforcement, and got the details of the action plan for the next day, which would be our day in the desert. No More Deaths was incredibly thoughtful as organizers of this event. They organized local volunteers to prepare and serve our meals. They provided places to stay or helped us locate accommodations. They provided a packing list telling us what to bring. The metal fine-toothed comb stuck out to both Michelle and I as oddly specific. I prefer a little hair gel and just my fingers personally, but We came to learn later that the comb is for removing jumping cactus from our shoes and clothing. Most importantly, though, and most impressive, is that No More Deaths operates from a place of relationality. They recognize the autonomy of the migrants that they meet. Before they do anything, the volunteers ask permission to provide aid. Then, of course, in the course of receiving aid, if the migrant chooses to share, the volunteers listen to the stories and the experiences of the people who are crossing the desert. And now I'd like us to hear Michelle Bloodworth talk about her experience of being in the desert.
I've been privileged with many opportunities and choices in my life. Two important ones have been becoming a community psychologist and becoming a UU. I realize I'm lucky that both my vocation and my faith provide principles that guide both my work and my life. Many of you are familiar with our UU principles, but let me share with you a few of community psychology's principles. They include social justice, sharing power, recognizing the ripple effects of our actions, and that multiple levels of analysis are important for us to really understand what's happening. I mention these principles because, like our UU principles, they become part of who I am and part of how I engage in the world. And they're important to how I came to be on this journey to the borderlands with Dan. Listening to one of the founders of my field a few years ago at a conference, I was impressed when she said, if we truly follow the community psychology's principles, that we shouldn't be surprised if we end up being arrested at some point. That impressed upon me. I was listening to that, and when I received an email, what she was pointing to, let me just say, is to the reality that following our principles can place us at odds with those in power. And sometimes that places us, and the consequences can be things like arrest. When I received an email from the UU College of Social Justice with an invitation to participate in this action that Dan was just talking about in the desert, and it cautioned participants that we could face arrest, it caught my attention. The idea of participating was certainly intriguing and scary. When an opportunity feels scary to me, I try to pay attention. I have found that when I truly turn towards opportunity that make me move outside of my comfort zone and raise my anxiety, that they've often resulted in some of the richest and most powerful experiences in my life. I'm not yet sure whether my experience jumping off a cliff in New Zealand with my teenage son qualifies, but we'll see. Turning towards what scares us is not always easy, though. So in this case, I procrastinated. And yet, as Dan was sharing, I continue to be pulled towards saying yes to this opportunity to witness and take action in solidarity with the humanitarian aid workers in Arizona. In the end, I informed my family of my decision, and I told Dan I would join him for the journey. On Sunday, and I'll just mention that Dan and I were in two separate groups, and he was part of the group that you saw in the video. So what I describe is part of the experience that my group had. So on Sunday, the day we were to travel into the desert, I awoke before 5 a.m., got dressed, and gathered my gear. While I was prepared with all the necessary training and clothing and water, I still felt uneasy because I did not know what we would be facing with respect to encountering law enforcement and with the physical elements. The temperatures were expected to reach 116 degrees that day. And I just didn't know how my body would handle carrying gallons of water in that kind of heat. During the long drive to our destination, some in my van carried on conversations while others looked out the window at the beautiful and yet harsh landscape, contemplating what was before us. With Sharpies, we drew messages of hope and peace on the water jugs, and we sang together. As we got closer to our destination, we encountered National Park Service agents who were alerted to our planned action and were expecting us. They didn't look like the rangers that I experienced on vacations to Yosemite. These were well-armed law enforcement. And they took down, each of us had to go online and get a permit before we journeyed to the desert, and they wanted to see all of our permits, and they courteously reviewed and documented identifying information for each of us, and then they told us that we could go on our way. We were later told that the agent's courteous manner was quite different from the hostility and intimidation that they direct towards volunteers on a regular basis. When we arrived at our destination, we exited our vans and started to form a human water chain with 40 of us standing side by side with about 10 feet between each of us. The plan was for us to walk a short distance and have anyone who was not able or did not wish to go further place their water jugs and return to the van. Everyone else would continue for 30 minutes and then place our water. After quite a bit of effort and time, our long line was formed and we began to slowly walk together forward. It was challenging for this many people to walk at the same pace and to stay in a line, so we were frequently asked to slow down and stop to allow the line to reform. It felt like we were moving at a snail's pace and the temperature was continuing to rise. It was not long before one and then two people from our group started to experience distress from the heat. We all stood in place while volunteers assisted those individuals. Standing still in that scorching sun with 2 gallons of water in my pack was certainly the hardest part of it all. As I stood there with the external temperature rising, I could feel my internal temperature rising as well as my fear and frustration. I drank and poured water over my head, and they helped a little, but it didn't take away the heat. I kept looking out across that inhospitable desert and thinking about the migrants that were out there at that very moment, having been traveling for days or even weeks. I knew no one would undertake that journey unless they felt there was no other choice. News that it was time to place our water jugs came as a relief, as I was increasingly concerned that if I remained in the sun much longer, I'd become ill. We started our way back towards the vehicles, and when they came into sight, I felt such relief. Those last 100 yards, though, were not easy. Upon reaching the van, I was given ice to rub on my face and neck to try to cool down, and climbing into the air conditioning, I felt some relief, but it took a long time before I felt anywhere close to normal again. Many hours later that night, as I lay trying to fall asleep, I could still feel heat radiating from my skin as if I'd been burned. As hard as the experience was, emotionally and physically, the weekend gave me many gifts. One gift has been a greater understanding of the multiple factors that have led to this current crisis of death in the desert. With over 7,000 remains having been found in that large area since 2001. 7,000 remains. I learned of a policy referred to as prevention through deterrence that since the mid-1990s has led to crackdowns in urban areas that have forced migrants to travel along more remote and dangerous routes, such as the areas that Dan and I placed water in over that weekend. Soon after I returned home, I heard from an old friend who had seen Facebook posts about my experience. She shared with me about her cousin, Jaime, a father of 4 American-born children who had returned to Mexico to renew his visa that he needed to do every 10 years. But his renewal was rejected. With no other recourse available, he called his family to let them know he'd hired a coyote or guide to help him cross the desert, and that it would take 3 to 5 days. Then they heard nothing. Finally, the family was able to speak to someone who had been traveling with Jaime. The picture he painted was heartbreaking. Jaime's feet became injured during the crossing, and he was lagging behind the group. On the 6th day, the guides left him about 60 miles from Ajo, the town where Dan and I stayed, with a gallon of water. The temperatures reached 106 degrees that day. His remains were found 4 days later by tribal police in the area. I ask you, what would you do in Jaime's place? What lengths would you go to return to your family, your community, your home? I ask you now to take a few moments, turn to your neighbor, and share your answers to those questions.
To what lengths would you go to get back to your family? To what lengths would you go to get back to your community? What would you do to get back to your home? Would you cross a hostile desert? It can be hard to imagine being in the shoes of a migrant, but I'll tell you one thing. It's a lot easier to imagine when you're standing out there in the desert. Our group of 60 Faith Floods the Desert participants was split into 2 missions. The first, which Michelle went on, was called Devil's Highway. And their strategy was, as Michelle talked about, to create a water line of people to stand out as far as they can go and to drop water all the way across the desert so that it's easy to find as people make their way north. I went on the other mission, the one that you saw in the video, called Charlie Bell Pass. The idea for this one was to drive as close as possible to a highly trafficked migrant passage and then hike the rest of the way, which was just a little over a mile, to a place where we knew migrants would find our water, and then to drop as many gallons there as possible. Hike in a mile, and then back out. No sweat. Actually, there was sweat. There was a lot of sweat. The location we were going to required a permit, which everyone in our group had obtained online prior to arriving at the action. In the permit application, we were required to sign that we were agreeing not to litter and not to leave anything in the desert, specifically naming water, food, clothing, shoes, and blankets, the very things that might save lives. Again, this is what the specific targeting and criminalization of aid looks like. So as our small convoy of trucks made its way along the only road to our destination, we encountered a team of armed rangers waiting to greet us and check our permits. They were conspicuously polite to us, which, according to our No More Death guides, was drastically different from how they normally act. And I'm not sure if their attitude adjustment was due to the religious vestments that we were wearing. I was wearing this stole out there in the desert. Or if it was the presence of no fewer than 4 professional journalists pointing cameras at them. One of which was Jorge Rivas, who did that video for Color Lines. After recording all of our names from the permits that we showed them, we were allowed to proceed. When we reached the end of the road, we got out of the trucks, grabbed as many gallons of water as we could carry, and headed toward our destination on foot. Being from Albuquerque, I thought I knew how to handle desert heat. After all, it's a dry heat, right? Not like that humid heat in other parts of the country. This is still the Southwest. How different could it be? The Arizona desert is another kind of hot. Dry, yes, but even a dry heat, when it gets above 110, has a saturated feeling to the air, like the heat actually has some weight to it. And so the heat itself felt like carrying a few extra pounds. Add that to the gallon of water that each of us was carrying for our own consumption, plus the 2 or 3 more gallons that we were delivering to the drop point, either by hand or in our pack or a combination of those things. At about 8 pounds per gallon, it starts to add up. So although it was just a little over a mile, it took about an hour to reach the drop point, a place called Charlie Bell Pass. There was a beacon there, a bittersweet symbol in the desert. For migrants facing injury or illness, they could go to this beacon, signal it, and aid in the form of law enforcement would arrive. Their lives would be saved, but they would then be caught up in the process of deportation. And so my group and I dropped half of our gallons of water here at this beacon, knowing that migrants would be able to find the water here. That was shown in the video as well. And then, because the beacon is such a monitored location, we also headed off the trail about another quarter mile or so to place the other half of the water that we brought, the other half of the gallons, along the hillside in the sparse shade of some of the low brush. This way, migrants wishing to avoid the beacon could still find life-saving water for their dangerous trek. Then we regathered. We sang together to refill our spiritual canteens before hiking back to the trucks. When we got back to where our vehicles were parked, a park ranger truck was sitting there and the occupants were watching us. But they didn't stop us or question us other than to ask if we were all doing okay. "It's a hot one today," they said. "Is everyone drinking enough water?" And we assured them that we were. Then we loaded back into the air-conditioned trucks and drove back to town. Now, as of today, we still don't know if we will be charged with federal misdemeanors for littering in the desert. No More Deaths told us that the 8 volunteers who had been charged with federal misdemeanors, or have been charged with federal misdemeanors, for doing what we had just done, were not arrested on the spot. Rather, their notification of charges came in the mail at a later date, months later. And because our permits were checked, this was a possibility for us as well. And so, we wait. If we do get charged, we have been asked by No More Deaths not to pay the fines, but to contest the charges on moral grounds, to fight it. As people of faith, we have rights to religious liberty, to practice our religion by doing the sacred work of saving lives. Now, Michelle and I traveled to Arizona to see the awful effects of our broken immigration system firsthand along the border, but immigration is not only a problem there. While the challenges in Ajo, Arizona may look different than here in Albuquerque, the reality is our government's harmful immigration policies are harmful everywhere. The fight for immigrant justice is real, and you don't have to go to the border to be involved in it. Did you know that First Unitarian has its very own immigrant justice task force? If you didn't know, we do. They are a highly functioning, well-organized group doing important work on immigration issues right here in Albuquerque. For example, did you know that there are currently 2 people in Albuquerque living in sanctuary? That is, they are living in churches to stay protected from ICE. And did you know that teams of volunteers from our church provide support by accompanying these 2 people for a 24-hour period every week? Now, this is only one possible way that you might get involved. The Immigrant Justice Task Force has a few teams that are looking for members right now. In order to find out all that they're working on, they have a table in the social hall, just through those doors and down the hall, that you can visit after the service. Members of the task force will gladly answer any questions about their work and talk to you about ways that you might get involved and opportunities to offer your support. And if you're looking for a really low commitment way to fight the unjust system that has led to thousands of deaths, you can sign on to 2 letters in support of the No More Deaths organization. One letter is directed to land managers in the Arizona desert, encouraging them to grant civilian access to aid workers and to remove the restrictions against leaving water, food, blankets, clothes, and other forms of aid. The other letter is to the Arizona District Attorney, encouraging them to drop the charges against the 9 humanitarian aid workers that are facing ridiculous and immoral federal charges. If you're interested, you can sign both of these letters at the Immigrant Justice Task Force table in the social hall after the service. Please do what you can to fight this unjust system that is literally killing people. If nothing else, please sign the letters. Because the values of our shared faith tell us that saving lives is never illegal. And may it be so.